Pipes, and I'm president of the Pacific Research Institute. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this wonderful luncheon event co-sponsored by Pacific Research Institute and the Manhattan Institute. It is noteworthy that both PRI and MI were founded by the same founder, Sir Anthony Fisher. This event, The Beholden State, California's Lost Promise and How to Recapture It, was made possible by the generosity of the Correct Foundation and a donor to both of our organizations who wishes to remain anonymous. I'm delighted that Adam Hirschfelder and Gabriela Chavez-Lopez are planning to be here, but they're not here as yet. But we want to thank the Correct Foundation for their generosity. And they're both donors to PRI and MI on other issues as well. So we love the Correct Foundation. While there's not time to recognize everyone here, all of those people who helped to make this event the terrific event that it is, but I would like to recognize a couple of people. Jody Morales, founder of Citizens for Sustainable Pension Plans. It is a marvelous organization that is on the front lines fighting for public sector pension reform. And Terry Moe, who is not here yet either, but he's a professor of public policy at Stanford and author of the best-selling K-12 education book, Teacher Unions and America's Public Schools. This book is essential reading for anyone concerned about the future of our nation, which depends upon an educated workforce. Many people put a lot of effort to make this event the success that it is, and I'm most grateful for everyone's contribution. However, I would like to thank Cindy Chin for her outstanding efforts on handling all of the details and getting such a large audience here in San Francisco, in the left coast. So thank you, Cindy. It is now my pleasure to introduce Brian Anderson, who is going to be the moderator of our panel today. He is the editor of City Journal, MI's Cultural and Political Quarterly. He has served as the editor of the City Journal since 2007. The Beholden State is a collection of City Journal's finest essays, and you must read it because it will reinvigorate you on all kinds of really interesting things that you probably haven't spent a lot of time thinking about. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy what I believe is going to be a terrific program. Brian?
Thank you very much, Sally. Steve Malanga and I were on the Dennis Prager show yesterday and mentioned we were heading up to San Francisco, and he kind of looked scared and said, going up to the belly of the beast. But, we love coming to this beautiful city and are particularly gratified to see such a great turnout today for this event for our book. So thank you to Sally and to the Pacific Research Institute for putting this together for us. So why this book? Why The Beholden State? Several years ago, City Journal, the magazine I edit, as Sally mentioned, published by the Manhattan Institute, began to write extensively about California. And the reasons we started to do this were pretty powerful. How does it happen that a place just about everyone a generation ago was celebrating as the model for a prosperous 21st century American future, a state with a robust, diverse economy, a growing creative population, excellent public schools, and much else beside, is today burdened with unemployment well above the national average, outmigration of residents and businesses, fiscally crisis-ridden cities, and absurdly dysfunctional politics. Now, our premise in commissioning these articles by an absolutely wonderful group of journalists and analysts was that bad ideas and bad policies drove this decline, that in fact California's reversal represented one of the most powerful public policy stories really of our time. But our purpose wasn't just to understand what went wrong, it was also to show how to fix things. And we had seen how ideas mattered right in New York City, where our central offices are, which came back from out-of-control crime, blight, and disorder in the 80s and 90s to take its place again as a great metropolis thanks in large part to the implementation of a handful of key policy ideas, like broken windows policing, welfare reform, ideas that were promoted and argued for in the pages of City Journal and by the Manhattan Institute. So the Beholden State collects the very best, I think, of the work we've done to date on California and proposing a host of reform ideas. So today, our three distinguished panelists will look at different aspects of California's crisis as explored in the book. So let me just briefly introduce them, and they can come up and take their seats, I think, if they want to. We're under a very tight time demand here, so we should all prepare. Ben Boychuk is the associate editor of City Journal, where he writes extensively on education and on California, and he oversees our City Journal California page, which has been publishing all sorts of great stuff. Previously, he was the managing editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and these days he also writes a regular column for the Sacramento Bee on California issues and other issues. His work has appeared in the LA Times, Orange County Register, San Francisco Chronicle, many, many other papers. Stephen Hayward is the Thomas Smith Distinguished Fellow at the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University in Ohio, where he's directing a new program in political economy. He's a senior fellow here at PRI, and he also has a position at Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Public Policy. He holds a PhD in American Studies. He's an absolutely brilliant guy. He guest hosts on William Bennett's show, where I've heard him many times, on the Salem Broadcasting Network. And he's got a recent book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Presidents from Wilson to Obama. And it's a great read, let me tell you. Steve Malanga, my colleague, is City Journal senior editor. He's a Manhattan Institute senior fellow and a columnist for Real Clear Markets. His most recent book is called Shakedown, The Continuing Conspiracy Against the American Taxpayer. He has written a lot of this book, The Beholden State, and his essay entitled that gave the book its title, and it describes how union power has transformed California into a place where politicians increasingly must do labor's bidding, and government workers thrive at the battered private sector's expense. His work has appeared regularly in the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, Orange County Register, and a million other publications. So with that, let's get going. And Steve Hayward, you're up.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think you can just speak for me.
Okay, I'll do it from here. If we get the table mic on. There it comes. I think it's on. Well, thank you, Brian. I'm honored to be included in the celebration of launching your book. I thought what I would do for 5 minutes opening comments is make 2 points framed by invoking the memory and example of James Q. Wilson, a frequent and important contributor to City Journal over the years, who sadly left us a year ago. He was a native Californian who made much of his academic reputation at Harvard, and then at age 53 packed up and came back to the Golden State. By coincidence, that was the same age I decided to leave Washington, D.C., and the sort of fit of exhaustion with what goes on in the Capitol. Wilson, among other of his legendary articles, was a famous one from the 1960s called A Guide to Reagan Country. He wanted to explain to his friends at Harvard and at Commentary Magazine how it was that California could elect a movie actor as governor. People were baffled by this in the East. Imagine what they'd have thought if he had the perspicacity to predict, never mind Reagan, we'll elect this Austrian bodybuilder someday. People would surely have thought that the hippies had indeed sneaked some LSD into the water supply out here. One of the main points of that article was this was a middle-class state. It was affordable, dynamic economy. It was a place for entrepreneurs and people to come to buy a nice home at very reasonable prices, and that's what's been lost, I think, quite obviously, for quite a while now. If Wilson were still with us and writing a sequel to that article, A Guide to Post-Reagan Country, I think one of the things he would notice is something that I noticed that's a simple thing you can look at. I looked up the data yesterday. Having grown up here in Southern California and then lived up in the north for a time and been all over the state, one of the things I recalled is that every time California came out of a big recession, going back to the early 60s, you saw a boom in the single-family housing market. You usually saw coming out of the recession from trough to peak, housing starts would reach about 300,000 a year. And that was true in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then in the 90s it started to change. You know, the recession that cost the first President Bush's job in 1992, I don't know if you remember this, but a third of the nation's job losses were here in California. Largely the aerospace industries, but also in real estate. And even when the internet boom came along starting in the mid-90s, you didn't see recovery of the housing construction market like we'd seen in all the years before. Population was still growing. And as I say, the general economy was doing well, but what you began to see in the 90s was not only increasing constraints on land supply, some of that's for natural reasons of geography, but a lot of it was the steadily ratcheting up of regulations. And nowadays they're in high gear. And so one of the amazing things about the housing bubble of a few years ago is that housing starts in California were only about half of what they'd been at previous peaks in an economic cycle. You'd think if there was some place that would participate fully in the housing bubble, at least on the construction side, it would be California. And there were a few pockets out in the desert and so forth. And so it seems to me that to the extent you have a dysfunctional new housing market, that's a major piece of the puzzle that people ought to be more worried about, and less prone to embracing some of these utopian solutions of smart growth where we're all going to live in these little Venice, Italy-like villages that people are going to construct for us everywhere. Second point I'll make quickly is you're reading the book, it's easy to get gloomy, right? I mean, you catalog an impressive rogues galleries of problems. And yet there at the end is Victor Davis Hanson, who can do a Dr. Doom imitation to match anyone, right? Who is optimistic about things. And right now you look out and notice that California is sitting on these extraordinary energy resources. And I always thought, perhaps too optimistically, but I've always thought at some point the desire to prop up the welfare state would come in conflict with environmental purism, and liberals would have to choose. And I always thought the welfare state would win. Now, it hasn't happened yet. On the other hand, one straw in the wind you've seen recently is an attempt in the legislature to put new restrictions on hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas exploration. That was voted down. Interesting little break from the conventional wisdom about this. And maybe that's the first glimmer. I predict that the next change you might see will be when we can no longer put off some of the overdue pension bills. And at that point, even liberals are going to wake up and say, if we want to pay for some of these pensions, maybe we need to unlock some of our energy resources because of the immense royalties they would generate, as well as taxes from employment to the state. So I think that's one sign of optimism I can join in, although it's going to take a while. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you. I guess I want to quickly try to sum up the themes of this book, which has numerous authors in it. And if I could do it very quickly, I'll do it this way, actually, beginning by telling you a story that has nothing to do with the book. And that is about a year ago, I was invited to go down to Texas and speak before Texas legislators, conservative Texas legislators. There may be conservatives in this room, but there are real conservatives in Texas. And I said, well, what do you want me to talk about? Well, we want you to talk about the pension problems and other problems of government and solutions around the country. So I get down there, and what I find out what they really want to talk about is how do we avoid becoming California? Californians always laugh at that story, but it's true, and it's not I never thought it was a joke, but that is what they are consumed by. And although I was amused, I was not shocked, because through the years, as I've written about different places, I hear from people in places like Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas, I hear that kind of stuff over and over again. Not necessarily just about California, certainly about New York a lot more. And I have quite a bit of experience writing about New York, too. And what we came to is, I was kind of prepared for this, and as we talked through, what I told them, and I think they understand this, is that prosperity, once achieved, has to be defended. And the problem is that in prosperous places, and we saw this in New York, and we're starting to see it in California, it's natural when you become prosperous, when standards of living rise, it's natural to ask for more government. I mean, maybe it's not natural if you're reading your Hayek, but the average person is not reading his Hayek, and the average voter, it looks for necessarily a little bit more government, innocently. The problem is this. I like to say, now this is not exact, but if you think if your population increases what we would describe as arithmetically, government power increases exponentially. And the reason it does is because the big government coalition is a 24-hour machine. All of you in this room are not 24-hour lobbyists for small government. You want to go home and be with your families. You want to be at your churches. You want to be wherever. But they are not. And so at some point, government reaches a tipping point. And we've seen this around the country. So in a way, the essays in this book are various takes on that. What City Journal does is completely contrary to every trend in journalism these days, and I say this with a well-known blogger to my left here, which is we write long analysis of these things. And my lead article, my lead piece in this, the title piece, is really a history of how public sector unions gained power in the state, going all the way, that's 4,000 words, going back years. Another piece that's related to that, it's about the pension crisis. It goes all the way back to the 1930s, tells the story of CalPERS. In particular, we called it the pension fund that ate California. And that's actually the title. I was inspired by that because someone told me, California used to be a state, and now it's a pension fund where people live. But what holds these, when you read these things and the other long pieces, what you realize is that things don't happen like this. They happen incrementally. And not only do they happen incrementally when taxpayers and voters aren't paying attention during eras of prosperity. I know this very intimately because I've been writing about the big government coalition for a long time, and I often find myself frustrated because during periods of prosperity I'm saying, look what's happening, look what they're doing, and it isn't until later that we find out what the implications of this will be. So this is a challenge that California now faces, and in particular, I want to take, I'm always optimistic when I come out here because I see the weather and I see the, cities like San Francisco, and I say it's not going to just fall apart. But let me say finally, and we'll talk much more, I think, in the question and answer period, is that to play off of Steve's optimism, let me say finally that I think the biggest threat that California now faces is not merely the threat from the power of the big government coalition. It's the threat from the emergence as a result of that of what I call the two Californias. We saw this in New York. You see, the problem is the conservatives, and in particular conservative commentators, seem to see California as an either-or situation. When I go on television, particularly conservative talk shows, all they want to know is when is California going to collapse? California is not going to collapse. But what we see is the emergence of what we saw in New York, a globalized economy of wealthy businesses that can be sustained in this environment and can provide jobs for a certain part of the population, and at the same time can sustain the political structure with its taxes in Sacramento so that there's not reform, while at the same time around the rest of the state you don't see the reemergence, the revitalization of that economy. And so as a result, you have, for instance, of the 27 metro areas in the country that still have double-digit inflation, 11 of them are here in California. It's not Napa Valley, it's not San Francisco, but it is the Inland Empire, it is the Central Valley. So this is, I think, the challenge of California, and I would love to talk more about this in the question and answer period, but now I think I'm just going to be quiet and let my colleague Ben Boychuk go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to talk a little bit about the public education landscape in California, and I'll keep my opening remarks as brief as can be, and maybe we can get into this more later on. But when Jerry Brown was elected governor, the first thing he did was sack the State Board of Education and appointed his own people, among whom was the California Teachers Association's chief lobbyist in Sacramento. He'd barely taken the oath of office, and that was one of his earliest acts as governor. And so that kind of set the tone for the Brown administration vis-a-vis education. He earlier this month, The National Education Association honored Brown as the best education governor in the United States. Yeah, well, he has a great reputation with the unions. Whether he is a great education governor is another story. So, but one of the second things that Governor Brown did after he got into office was he started talking about the tax increase that we all voted for. Did we all vote for that in November? Nobody in this room, oddly enough. He started talking about the need for tax increases, and he's very coy, as Brown often is. He said, he told reporters at an early press conference, "I don't want to say I've got a gun to people's heads, but if we don't get our tax increase, we're going to have to essentially gut public education." And that was his theme for the first couple of years, and leading up to the vote last November, where Proposition 30 passed. And the idea there was very simple. We will restore these cuts that we've made to education. We will pour billions of dollars in new money into the public schools. And he said, you can audit us, and we're going to send all this money back to the districts that we've taken away. And that's true up to a point. The tax increase is supposed to generate anywhere from $6.8 to $9 billion, of which they say 89% is going to the public schools. But what they don't say is about half of that money is going to go from the districts back to the teachers' pension fund, which is desperately underfunded. The CalSTRS says they need about $4 billion a year for the next 30 years to be solvent. So it's been a kind of a bait and switch when it comes to funding public schools. It isn't all bad, and we'll talk a little bit about this later on in the Q&A, I think. There are some reforms that have taken place in the past couple of years that are actually encouraging and have set the tone nationally, believe it or not. But the fact is, we have a governor right now, and we have a state legislature that is completely owned and operated by the California Teachers Association, that is steadfastly against meaningful reforms, and they're doing their level best to whittle away at what's good, what has worked in California: charter schools, open enrollment, the parent trigger law, which I write about in the book. And so that's kind of where we are right now. The CTA is riding high, the CFT is riding high, and Governor Brown, to some extent, has put checks on some of the more excessive legislation, but they're pushing and they're pushing and they're pushing, and they're going to keep pushing until they get everything they want. So with that, we can go into more detail in the Q&A, but with that, I'll turn it back to Brian.
Thanks, Ben. That was particularly gloomy. The book is actually far more optimistic, as Steve Hayward
I was saving the
noted.
optimism for later.
Yeah, yes, it isn't all doom and gloom, and one of the themes of the book, and I wondered if Steve Hayward could talk about it because it relates to his comments, is how the budget pressure being created by the pension and health care obligations is increasingly crowding out other key essential government services, many of which liberals care for quite a bit. So when you're closing public libraries or making a city unsafe in order to pay the pensions of people who are retiring in their 50s, might this not over time be a kind of wake-up call to at least some on the left that this is an unsustainable model? Yeah, Steve.
Well, yeah, I mean, now I've only been back in the state for a year, but from afar I was noticing that every once in a while, of all voices making exactly that point, was Willie Brown in his sort of column he has here in the San Francisco Chronicle, trying to imitate Herb Cain. He can't, but he gives it a game try. And I mean, I've thought all along that at some point smart liberals are going to figure that out and say, hey, wait a minute. But now the problem is their power base is the unions. So here's the interesting question to me is, I sort of sum it up this way, sort of bumper sticker formula. 100 years ago, we had progressive reform because the state was dominated by Union Pacific. Well, guess what? Union still figures in that problem of special interest domination, right? And so it seems to me the trick is going to be, as a matter of persuasion, is how to talk to the people of California to make a point about how, this speaks off Steve Malanga's, I think, very good point that people want more government in certain ways. I think the question is this the government you want? A lot of reasons to say no. But then second is I think you want to be able to make a distinction to the citizens between our public servants, the ones we think do a good job, many teachers who are very good in the schools, and the unions that have completely corrupted and are wrecking the way our government works. Because I do think, just as a matter of political persuasion, you get into blizzard of numbers and people's eyes glaze over, and that's why I don't master them usually. But I think more and more people are going to need to come to see that.
Thanks, Steve. This is a question for Steve Malanga. One of the major themes of the book is the toxic business climate in the state and how that came to be. Could you say a bit more about what the principal problems are, how the union issue has contributed to that climate, and what might be done about it?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to understand when I talk about, for instance, two Californias, the high cost of doing business here is something in particular that those kinds of businesses that generate blue-collar jobs or generate jobs or just aren't high technology firms generating, throwing off high profits. It impacts those businesses in particular. So I think that the business environment, the very difficult business environment in the state does contribute to the emergence of the two Californias. I would put it in a couple of ways. Number one, I don't think people realize this, but by objective measures, Tax Foundation is one group that studies the states. California has the second highest business tax burden in the country. Its overall tax burden is not that high because it's disproportionately on businesses. That's very tough, and always in general. We see this in New York City too, because I think individually New York City's tax burden is far higher than California as a state. And so you still get very high net worth businesses there, but that's what you get, and so you get this kind of very high net worth individuals, and then you get a service economy serving them, and not much in between. And that is part of the danger of the high tax burden in California. But having just raised taxes by $7 to $8 billion, I don't immediately see change there. You also have a very high regulatory burden here, and I don't have to tell you, I don't have to explain that to you. I see more hope there because you can change the regulatory burden. You can lighten it and make it more sensible, even in difficult budget times. Governor Christie's trying to do that in New Jersey, for instance. They have no operating room in their budget, so he can't change that, but he can change this. And I see hope there for the same reason that Steve was talking about hope, because I do know, and I've been told by legislators in Sacramento, that even the public sector unions are worried about the decline in the business environment because they understand essentially where the dollars come from. And so I think that's a place to sort of attack very, very carefully and very seriously. And let me say, we actually have a piece by the demographer Wendell Cox in this issue, which follows job migration. Most people are familiar with people migration, but there are databases that will look at job migration. And California is a net loser of jobs. In other words, when you look at jobs coming in and out. Now, it gains jobs in other ways, especially through creation of new jobs by entrepreneurial companies, but it's a net loser of jobs. And you will not be surprised to learn that the #1 destination of jobs out of California that migrate is Texas. I mean, that's what Wendell's study's saying. You'll find it fascinating. It's in the book, right?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Got a lot of stuff in the book, so it's hard to keep track of it sometimes. Ben Boychuk, if you could say a little bit more, California is actually such a big place that there are school choice innovations going on here.
Right.
So say a bit more about those and what's being done to develop them or stop them.
So, yeah, I mean, California, as bad as the schools can be, and Lance Izumi at PRI has done great work showing that, even the supposedly better schools in well-funded districts aren't that great. But there are still enclaves where you have good public schools, and California does have a pretty robust system of public school choice. Vouchers never took off here. You know, I'm sure people in this room are familiar with the history of the voucher fights in the state with the ballot initiatives that were, defeated, outspent 5-1 by the unions. But we do have a pretty good system of public school choice here. But the other thing we have, and I write about this at length in the book, California in 2009 passed the nation's first parent empowerment law, which is better known as the parent trigger. And this, I believe, is reason for hope, because this law, it hasn't been used all that much yet. It's only been used at this point about half a dozen schools down in Southern California. But it has driven the unions out of their minds. I mean, the first parent trigger, and the way the law works, just briefly, the way the law works is, if you're in a failing school, if you have it's in the bottom 10% of schools in the state, if 51% of parents at that school sign a petition, they can compel the local district to impose certain changes. You can convert the school to a charter school, for example. You can fire the principal. You can replace the staff. You can do some other things that involve longer school hours and after-school tutoring and that sort of thing. When the first parent trigger petition was filed at the end of 2009 in the community of Watts, which is in South Central LA, the unions pushed back hard, and it ended up in court. And but for a date box on the petitions, the parents would have prevailed. But the judge said, your petitions were formatted incorrectly. They had the signatures. The people wanted to convert this school, which was just a god-awful school, but they were beaten on a technicality. So the next parent trigger petition was in a high desert community called Adelanto, which is not far from where I live. And they got a little smarter on that one, and they prevailed. And they're opening a charter school this fall at another failing Desert Trails Elementary School is what it's called. And so after that, the resistance from the unions, once you set precedent, and once you had some favorable court rulings in that instance, well, all of a sudden down in South LA, parents are submitting these petitions. They're getting cooperation from Los Angeles Unified. They're getting people on board with these changes. And that suggests that you can get some real reform that way. Because the districts aren't going to do it, the principals aren't going to do it, the teachers in some cases will do it, but the unions certainly won't. But the parents will. I mean, the parents obviously don't want their kids going to terrible schools, and these are the ones who have beat their head against the wall for in some cases, years, trying to get somebody to listen. Well, the law requires them to listen.
So this is something that can be built on, definitely.
Yeah, and several other states around the country now have taken this idea. They've passed their own versions of parent triggers, and basically tied to charter school conversion and things like that. So it's really kind of taken off, and it started in California. So I think that's reason for optimism.
There we go. An optimistic Ben Boychuk. All right, I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open the discussion to this big room of interested people. You listen to the New York Times. Adam Nagurney continues to write front-page stories. California is back. Jerry Brown's been on the cover of, I think, every major national magazine as California's savior. Even The Economist magazine is saying California is back. And all of these conservatives, and Nagurney called the Manhattan Institute by name, are chicken littles. They don't understand what the state's all about, and everything is fine again. Now, we disagree with that, I assume. Steve Hayward.
Well, picking on the New York Times is sort of easy sport, right? Easy pickings. There's two or three ways to think about that. One is that if there were a conservative governor, I wonder if they would still be saying it the same way. It is partly ideological partisanship, point number two, that the bar has been moved so low that it's easy to clear, right? And I think that explains an awful lot of it right there. Plus, you put that in the context, point number 3, of a national recovery that's pretty feeble, right? Although I think my hunch is that as the nation begins to maybe get a little more momentum, the disjunction between California and the rest of the country will become more obvious. Right now, we're sort of close enough to Ohio and other states that are recovering but not very well. And again, just hold the lamp on Texas, right? That's what a real recovery looks like, because they never actually slumped as bad as the rest of us.
Steve Malanga, did you want
Well, I would
to
say,
add to
first
that?
of all, I think my response is look at, again, the emergence of the two Californias. And so basically, you can make either argument by picking either of those set of facts. And I think that's what's going on. I will say from a fiscal point of view, and again, fiscal recovery is not economic recovery, but I will say from a fiscal point of view, in fairness to the New York Times, that about 3 days after Adam Nagurny's last story on how the budget was in great shape, the Times is very excellent. Municipal finance writer Mary Williams Walsh wrote a piece pointing out that California basically has a surplus because it's not paying off its debts, including its pension debts, and that's where, if it in fact was properly funding its pension system and so forth, it would have no surplus. And she didn't only pick on California, although the headline was all states, and then 3/4 of the piece was on California. She makes a very, very valid point. As Ben pointed out, just adequately funding the CalSTRS system by their standards would eat up a lot of what's considered the surplus here in California. So I do think that this is one of those situations where it is a mixed message, and therefore people are kind of choosing their ideological positions, and I guess that's fine, but I think that right now what worries me is that this is exactly the way people looked at New York, and when they saw New York City coming back, they said everything is fine. Meanwhile, even Eliot Spitzer, when he went as governor up to upstate New York, said, wow, this looks like Appalachia, compared to Appalachia. I think that's the real issue that California faces.
The day after Paul Krugman had a column saying the same thing, California's back, the very next day, the state auditor came out with a report saying we have a negative net worth.
All right, well, let's open the floor to some questions, and there are 2 microphones, so please wait for the microphone to arrive, and please ask a question and keep it brief rather than making any kind of long editorial statements, just so many people get a chance. So we'll start over here in the back of the room. Just wait for the mic. Thank you.
A lot of the opening remarks you described, Steve, California's housing recovery as dysfunctional compared to the rest of the country. And there were and how California really isn't coming back, notwithstanding the comments in the New York Times and elsewhere. Just a word of caution, which is going to end up being a question. It's very easy for us with our political orientation to say the housing market was dysfunctional. But when you have a state which is fairly committed, has declared war on the automobile and war on sprawl, there are many people who would look upon the failure of housing to grow as being proof that it's functional. That's their goal. So for us to say it's dysfunctional, we're looking through too narrow a view. And to describe, to make fun of commentators who say California is back. Well, to a lot of the people, California is back. Look what we've done. We've raised taxes substantially without compromise, and from a liberal point of view, things are going great. So we have to be very careful about being too smug in our comments that it's dysfunctional. It's only dysfunctional from our point of view, not from theirs.
You know that, I mean, I barely scratched the surface of that big topic. I would say that once upon a time, it would have been liberals who said this state of affairs was dysfunctional, because they, with good reason, were the champions of the middle class. And now it's sort of liberal/progressive doctrines that say California is back exactly the way we want it. Right? And that's been the big change. That this is why I say that people who say they're liberals today really aren't. They're quite something else. footnote and books and long articles to follow. Fred Siegel and I used to talk about this a lot, about the famous social limits to growth theory, that people at some point were going to become satisfied with the way things were, including a lot of upper middle class people, and would not like growth. And just one more example that's happened in Oregon a few years ago, when the economy, 10 years ago, when the economy was going well, and the state employment director said, well, we don't think we want Intel to open a new factory, because, it's not just about jobs. There's an employment director saying we're not really interested necessarily in more jobs. That kind of thing is rampant in California. There's lots of examples of that kind of mentality going on here. So that's a big subject you've raised.
Okay, let's go to the right of the room, at the back, and then we'll move forward.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading the book, and in particular the section on education. So much of the conversation in education has been about vouchers and choice and increasing choice among school districts, and I haven't seen enough attention placed on how we aren't really rigorously hiring and evaluating and tenuring our teachers. And perhaps you address that in the book to some degree, but can you address that? Because there is no way any entity that wants to succeed, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit, would adopt the hiring and evaluation and tenure system that we have in our education system.
Right. This was the big fight, and of course, there was a story in the Los Angeles Times this week. I don't know if you folks saw it, but about how the Brown administration is actually butting heads with the Obama administration on this very question. California decided not to get an exemption from No Child Left Behind because there were just too many strings attached. But the remaining strings include adopting this federal teacher evaluation system. Now, from a conservative or a libertarian point of view, you think we really don't want the federal government imposing a evaluation system like that. But Arnie Duncan made the point that he said in the story, you could ask anybody in the education bureaucracy in California about, we know that they have terrible teachers, but you could ask them and they couldn't tell you who those terrible teachers are because we just aren't tracking them in any way. When the state was trying to get Race to the Top money a couple of years ago, there was a big fight about a teacher evaluation component. And that was shot down because the CTA lobbied very, very hard against it. They just did not want it. They lobbied against it at the state level. They've lobbied against it anytime it's come up in districts. So, in a way, I'm loath to say it. Maybe the Fed's coming down on them, coming down on the state on the teacher evaluation part of it may not be such a bad thing.
Thanks. Okay, let's move to the center of the room.
This is for Steve Hayward. I was like you thinking that ultimately California will get out of its problems by drilling, by doing fracking. There's that great golden resource there, black. But now I started thinking like an environmentalist, and I said, you know what? I bet you they're going to pass a regulation that stops California from using energy resource to pay off debt, pay off pensions, some type of constitutional amendment, because I think they see the writing on the wall too. And I'm wondering in ways to avoid bankruptcy, keeping the state from tapping into that resource.
Well, it's, having set on an optimistic note, I should probably repair to the famous Sam Goldwyn line, maybe Sam Goldwyn, never prophesy, especially about the future. One of the things I'm watching closely right now as a model, although I should ask you because I'm not sure I'm watching it closely enough, is Pennsylvania and New York, right? And also Eastern Ohio, which is doing very well, right? And New York has been blocking natural gas exploration. What is the latest on that? Do you know?
Well, actually, we have a story in the upcoming issue of City Journal, which is at the printer right now. We actually still send our publication to the printer.
It's back from the printer today, I just heard.
And it is about Pennsylvania and the revival of industrial areas of Pennsylvania. In fact, in Orange County yesterday when we spoke, when we met a doctor who grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. His brother inherited the farm. He came out to California. Guess who just retired because they put a well on his farm in Pennsylvania? So Pennsylvania is being revived. Meanwhile, upstate New York, where they had been doing no drilling whatsoever as part of the Marcellus Shale, no drilling whatsoever, and Manhattan Institute has done a big study on this, is not getting any of those benefits. Meanwhile, they're not drilling in New York because, of course, it's supposed to be an environmental blight. However, the big blight in New York City is that all of those big office towers and apartment buildings all are heated with oil burning oil burners. We can't get enough natural gas into New York where we would cut the emissions from the oil burners in half because we're not drilling and there's no pipelines. But Yoko Ono, who's building the Dakota, uses an oil burner, goes to Pennsylvania and protests against fracking. It's an illogical, I don't even know how you describe the system, but that's essentially what's going on in New York. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me that the asymmetries between the states on this at some point become telling. Now, that could be wrong, and that's why I'm watching New York as the test case. But, I mean, I used to drive from Washington to Ohio, and I'd go there for various reasons, and I'd take back roads. And, boy, you really do see the difference between the parts of Pennsylvania where cities are coming back, boarded up stores are now having the boards taken down, and people down here don't perceive that there's so many parts of the country that are like that in parts of upstate New York. And North Dakota, I mean, that's another story along the same lines. At some point, it seems to me that it just becomes impossible, or at least very difficult, to say we're just going to ignore this enormous boon that's here in front of us. Maybe we can. I know the environmentalists are fanatical and determined on this, and that's an important fact, but I think we'll see.
Before I just want to add one thing to that. I went up last year to speak at Hamilton College up in Clinton, New York. It's a very economically depressed area. Yeah. You just drive around there. The train station's basically abandoned buildings everywhere. But the faculty of the college had just signed universally, that they were in support of a ban on fracking. And that kind of sums up what we're up against on that in a liberal state like New York or California. But I think you're right, Steve. I think that the interest is just going to weigh out in the end. At the back of the room. Yes, microphone for the lady at the back of the room.
Thank you. The BART strike, or threatened resumption of the strike, really points up the biggest problem with the unions is that the people who pay their salaries, us, don't negotiate. And I think the best we can hope for is that they'll take the lesser increases, the greedy ones they want. You talk about getting energy to pay for union pensions. How about privatizing it? How about having the state say, who wants to buy BART, fire everybody, and run it economically?
Listen, I'm from New York. We know transit strikes. I mean, we know real transit strikes. I would say a couple of things. Of course, that's the solution. How close do you think privatization is of BART here in San Francisco? So unfortunately, it's not a realistic solution. But I will say this, that to go back to Steve's point, particularly with the pension system, or actually to go back to the gentleman over there, you asked, the liberals seem to think that things are great in California. That's actually only true about state government. There is enormous pressure on municipalities in California, enormous downward pressure, which is what the states in general are doing, and California is doing it. And the municipalities in California are still feeling that budgetary pressure. In part, they're feeling it because 70 to 80% of municipal budgets are compensation. So you can't run from something like pensions the way you can at the state level if you're paying your bills. There's enormous pressure. And so as a result of that, for instance, Chuck Reed, a progressive Democrat in San Jose, says, look at how we've cut police, we've cut fire. Jeff Adachi here in San Francisco, I'm sure you all know him, a progressive, says, look, we can't afford this system anymore. If you look around California, indeed there are plenty of liberals and progressives saying all is not well, particularly with the pension system and the pressure, the downward pressure. And so you do have people like Chuck Reed leading initiatives and referendums for that. I think that is a pretty good sign that all is not necessarily well in Oz.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Steve. All right, at this front table here.
It's coming behind you there.
It's coming slowly but surely.
Do you think a lot of these reforms can actually happen without some sort of functioning Republican Party in the state? I mean, because part of the problem, you're basically saying things are so bad that we'll choose between two bad choices, but one is less bad. Can the Republican Party step away from the social issues and focus on actually the fiscal issues, which then it can maybe actually get some people to pay
It's
attention
funny
to?
because really in a state like California, the fiscal issue should be everybody's number one concern. Oh, I'm not going to make that judgment. But here's the thing. In New York State, the Republican Party made the choice during decline to try to be accommodating because they thought that would save them, and it did the exact opposite. It merely made them irrelevant. And that is, I think, the danger. I see the same thing in California. I think that is the danger in California. So, you know, I mean, one of the reasons I see for the emergence, for instance, of the Tea Party around the country is that people recognize that in some places neither party represents them, and in fact it has to come from the ground up, and people are even willing to take $35 a year out of their pocket to join these Tea Party groups so that they can afford to send somebody to Sacramento or Albany or Trenton or Springfield who's watching and who at least comes back. Because the most optimistic thing you can say is this: there are more of us than them. There are more taxpayers and voters than there are members of the big government coalition. We just don't watch and pay enough attention. And I do think that some of what I was invited to and have spoken to Tea Party groups around the country, and many of them were simply former taxpayer groups, like local taxpayer groups, that became something more. There's just a sense that there needs to be a legitimate taxpayer party in America that's separate from the two parties.
Okay, we had a question at the far back of the room. Trying to get all the tables here.
Hi, just in answer to the person who queried people running, Catherine Baker here is running for State Assembly 16, one of the few Republican. I just met her. And typical problem with Republicans, she was too modest when she asked a question earlier to, first of all, announce who she was and say she needs money and she needs support. And she's representing the one of the few, maybe the only Republican seat in the Bay Area. My question, however, is this. Well, we have a dysfunctional four-branch governmental system in California. And we have two tribes. We have the wolves, and then we have the hardworking sheep. How do you fix the problem, given that the wolves represent the majority and the transfer of money will continue until eventually the whole thing goes bankrupt? Or, as we all know, the famous phrase from Margaret Thatcher, the only problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. How do we really fix the problem here?
What do you call the fourth branch, by the way? I'm just curious.
Unions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, all right, that works.
I mean, I think to a certain extent I just answered that. First of all, there are more sheep than wolves. The problem is they're sheep.
Yeah. The wolves have flaws. Yeah, you ask an easy question.
Yeah.
How do we fix this?
So I think I just answered that question. But I really do believe, and I've been saying this for a very long time, because I was the person writing when times were good, when we were in a housing bubble, when we were in a tech bubble in the 90s. Look at these terrible things they're doing. At some point, it's going to matter. My first book, The New Left, came out in 2005, warning about the big government coalition. Liberal publications all over the place said, what's this guy complaining about? They got a Republican president. They got two Republican houses. Even I would not have predicted that 3 years later. Yeah. So but I really believe that that we have to find a way in states in general for taxpayers to find themselves represented in places, in state capitals, full-time, and they're doing that in places by, as I said, large groups of people contributing $35, $40 to an organization that exists all year round, and they could send out an email saying, look what they're doing, because there are more of you, of us.
I'd like to see the Republicans in this state stop advocating stupid policies just because maybe the Democrats in some cases. I mean, redevelopment's a good example of this. Republicans in California in the legislature opposed Jerry Brown's effort to get rid of redevelopment agencies, basically because Jerry Brown proposed getting rid of redevelopment agencies. They opposed, I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago for the Sacramento Bee about empowerment zones, and they ended up coming up with a stupid solution for empowerment zones, empowerment, I'm thinking parent empowerment, enterprise zones. And Republicans wanted to go to the wall on enterprise zones, which are essentially, carve-outs, little carve-outs for businesses. They're not willing to make, more of a free market, and even to some extent populist argument, which is that, to leave the lick-spittle politics to the Democrats. Instead, they were going to the wall for enterprise zones. And so, if they would start thinking beyond merely being an opposition party as saying, merely opposing, and actually starting to propose some things and think through their opposition, I think that would be somewhat helpful.
Steve, oh, did you? Go ahead.
Well, it's just, I'm actually a little, you're a simple question, but I'm a little encouraged by your neighbor at the seat there, because I've been reminding people lately of a speech Ronald Reagan gave in 1977 when things looked bad for Republicans. And among the other things he said was, one of the things we just need is better candidates. So I think we've just seen one here. And people who bring more finesse to the subject. I mean, all these other questions that the gentleman here also asked about how do you talk sensibly about the relative priorities of things during the minds of Republicans is right. I think I would also add that, and you saw this in the fracking vote, that there's a split in the Democratic Party that ought to be exploited and or deepened somehow in some of the ways that. But think big. I mean, what Ben's pointing to is Republicans think like an opposition party, and it's not just enough to tape your no button down, unless you're going to be talking and thinking about big things to the citizens as a whole. I'll stop there. Go on all day.
All right, Steve Greenhut, and then over here.
I'd like another proposition, Hayward. Prop 13, where is it? Does it hold up? Do we end up with split rolls? What do you think?
I don't know. What's the old H.L. Mencken line that democracy is the theory that the people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard? I haven't looked at this lately, but for a while I was sort of sympathetic to Tom McClintock, who was saying, look, the business community plays ball too much with big government. We should raise their taxes. I don't know if that's right or not. I got to think that that's going to be on the table as something that's irresistible for liberals, because they've hated Prop 13 from the very beginning. And I'm also not convinced that it's, if you really run the numbers through because of the turnover in the housing market, I'm not convinced that it's that big a revenue hit. It's why I'm back in the state. I have an old house of my parents on their tax basis, and my taxes are a tenth of what they were in McLean, Virginia, which is sweet for me. But
All right, we have time for maybe two more questions. We'll go to table 14 over here. Wait for the microphone, please.
I'd like to come back to the statement that was made that there are more sheep than there are wolves. In light of the fact that there are 47% of the people who pay no taxes, which is very close to a majority, and you add to that 40% the people that work for government and the people that are in unions, and you have a built-in constituency for ever-growing government. I'd like to get your comment on that, because I think your premise that there are more sheep than wolves is very questionable.
A couple of things. First of all, don't confuse the federal tax system with the state tax system. State tax systems don't have nearly the exemptions that federal tax systems have. In addition, when states raise taxes, they do things like raise sales taxes. They do things like raise property taxes. The reason, for instance, that there is a successful Republican revolt up to a point in New Jersey is because blue-collar folks in places like construction unions could no longer afford to live in the state, could no longer afford the property taxes in this case. It's not the same model at all. And by the way, people who pay the taxes vote far more frequently than people who don't pay taxes. They're far more motivated to vote. So I don't think that model works on the state level. Remember sales tax, remember fees, I'll give you an example. Somebody in the state, it might have been the Los Angeles Times, cataloged all the different ways the states raised taxes over the last decade and fees. Everything from car fees to, people pay all those things. Nobody can escape those things. And they figure it out after a while. It's not just the income tax. At the state level, it's not even close to just being income tax. So I do think that there is more of a base there of a voter.
Okay.
I want to add just briefly, if I can, that I think we want to be I think we want to think carefully about the makers and takers theme. I mean, it's obviously true in some cases, but if you just want to take the 47% block that Governor Romney did, I don't think it's a given that we should make a uniform explanation for everyone who falls into that category. I think an awful lot of people would just as soon not be dependent on government. And I think so the old-time religion, if I can use that phrase, of American opportunity and individualism still works. And so part of the job is thinking about and explaining how that would be changed and why people would be better off if they're not part of that class. Not simple to do, but I think just be careful about taking the makers and takers theme too rigidly.
Okay, last question, the gentleman standing over by the wall. Oh, just wait for the mic, especially because you're so far back.
If we don't protect Proposition 13 for the businesses, then they won't be there to help us when they try to take Proposition away from the residences. And that's why we need to fight that.
Am I mistaken, but I have not seen a poll where fewer than 60% of Californians support Proposition. In other words, support for Proposition 13 cuts across. And I've never seen a poll where the support's been under 60%, unless I'm missing something or unless I'm out of date. But I think that it's still strong even among Democrats in the state, unless I missed the latest poll on this.
All right. Thank you very, very much to our panelists. Thank you all for coming. Please take a copy of The Beholden State, and thanks to the Pacific Research Institute.
Before you all leave, I know you all want to get to the elevator. Let us give a warm thank you to Brian Anderson and our panelists for a great job. I'd also like to remind you, you have a save the date on everyone's seat. This is our annual gala, November 1st. We have Charles Krauthammer as our keynote speaker, and we are honoring George Shultz, and Dr. Art Laffer will be doing the tribute to Mr. Shultz. So please put this on your calendar and attend. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your support. Bye-bye.